Hello, can you see my slides?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Great. Okay, well, thanks very much for having me. Hello, everybody. So I'm Joshua from Student Learning Services at University of Stirling. This is my presentation, Online Teaching Design for Better Focus and Happier Learners. My work is with a mix. My time is spent both with students and with staff, so doing student support in academic literacies, and then collaborating with staff embedded in faculties to develop programming in service of the same. So I see a lot of students, I work with a lot of staff, and that's kind of where this presentation is coming from. So it's based on some sort of a review that I've done on evidence-based research around information design, cognitive load, and how that might how some of the research might lead us to design learning and teaching environments that are a little bit more conducive to learner well-being and uh, performance. Okay, so let me, but this talk is very practical, really. So let me just jump into what I see as a problem today. So the problem is pretty simple: too much information. Okay, and here's someone pictured using their online learning environment, and it's a mess, and they're not happy about it, right? So I hear from students all the time that they feel overwhelmed. I've heard students complain that the online environment is confusing. It encourages constant multitasking and context switching. And I know that myself and my colleagues often feel this way too. So it's like a cultural thing. We're working within an information environment that's very busy, swampy, if you like, Dominic. And people miss things, right? We often see that people miss stuff in their assignments, in their modules, and so on. Lecturers often complain that students don't read. And well, I think that might be true in some cases, but I think there's a reason for that that's beyond the individual. It's systemic. So I think of this as a structural problem. You might know about the social model of disability, which says that, you know, if I'm in a wheelchair wheeling down the street and I can't access the places that I need to access, that shouldn't be thought of as my problem, but as society's problem to solve. So we design that collectively. Um, or you might look at this from a technological determinist perspective, which just says that technology, we invent these new technologies and they have all kinds of unforeseen consequences, some of which are good and some of which are bad. But they have a massive impact on our lives, the way we interact, our health, and so on. So let me get into some specifics here. Multitasking. So multitasking and context switching, which is often what we have to do when we're just like slogging through our digital knowledge work, is not how most brains work best. So we know from research that distraction harms performance, distraction increases stress, and here we have a couple of students who are likely feeling a little bit distracted, although they look fairly happy. But you know, they're texting, they're listening to music, perhaps eating, and they have their study materials. And there's probably people around them in the physical space as well. So that could be quite a distracting environment. So some of this we can influence, some of it we can't, of course. But I'll just focus on a few things that we can influence. So I like to think about cognitive load theory when I'm framing this for myself in my own teaching and design. Now, I'm not a psychologist or a cognitive scientist, so those among you who know this theory better than I do, please, I apologize for mucking that up. But basically, here's my rough go at it. All right, so we have three kinds of cognitive load: intrinsic cognitive load, which is essential to acquiring and storing knowledge. That's great. We need to have that. It's part of learning. Germane cognitive load, also important to integrating, contextualizing, and applying knowledge. I kind of correlate that in my little crude graphic here with a yellow traffic light, simply because I think as teachers we sort of intuitively regulate how much of that germane cognitive load we're sort of setting up for students, right? So how quickly information flows. And then what I'm really interested is the extraneous cognitive load. So what is unhelpful and harmful to learning? That's the red light there. Okay, that's the jackhammer on the head. That's the dog barking in the next room, or your phone vibrating when you really want to just be reading your book. Okay, so let's look at a few examples. So some common overload is just too much reading, too many decisions, and so on. Here's an image of Craigslist, which if you're like me, there's a certain nostalgic place in my heart for this kind of old school 1990s web interface, but I find it very hard to read and very hard to make decisions with lists like this. So too much reading, too many options. By the way, that Craigslist looks a lot like my university's student portal. So um, uh, frequent switching, so asking people to constantly go to one page or another page, one platform, design interface, always changing the scenario so that they have to constantly adjust their sort of expectations and their interactions. Related info in too many different places, right? So unnecessary redundancies, all of these things, like just basically disorganized information in many ways. So what are a few simple things that we can do when we're designing learning and teaching online? I'll just go through three or four. I'm not sure how many I've got here. One would be design learning paths for single tasking, right? And to minimize context switching. So here's a kind of an image of a student who's just doing one thing after the next. They're allowed, the design of the teaching materials allows them to focus on one thing at a time. We're not asking them to open 20 tabs on their web browser or to download 3 documents, one a PDF, one a Microsoft Word, etc. They're just able to focus on these things that are embedded in a single page, and they can do their activities. And the complexity that arises there should be in the difficulty of the problem, the germane stuff, right? The actions that they take, the imaginative tasks, etc. Not in trying to figure out a new website. Design single points of truth. I borrow this concept, spots, from software development. And I don't mean truth in any kind of ontological or epistemological sense. I just mean knowledge or information. So a place where we gather all of the relevant information for a certain project. So for example, for an assignment, we always give instructions, grading criteria, helpful tips, and quite often there's many different things that we attach to or sort of constellate, if you like, around an assignment. Do we always have to ask students to go 20 different places to find those things, or could we maybe consolidate them in one space that they can return to again and again and have it all sort of very, very clean and clear? I ask students to do this for themselves, of course, but if we can save them that trouble, then they get more quickly into the substance of the problems that they're trying to work through. Another thing we can do is minimize unnecessary choices. So here's a Wikipedia page. This might be fun to read if you're reading leisurely, but all these hyperlinks through the text, again, this is very like early web thinking where it's great to constantly just give people options to go to different places. But this is not how I'm able to focus. And I don't know about you, but I'd rather not have to decide if I'm trying to learn a lesson whether I should click on the word anchor or Google search, or I'd rather not have to make that decision. And I would certainly not like to click on something and go somewhere else before I've learned the lesson that I'm trying to learn. Another thing we can do is reduced redundancy, so bring things together again. Rather than having the same thing on 2 different pages of an online module, why don't we just decide on one place and keep it simple? So consolidate where possible. Where it's not possible, signpost when redundancy is needed. So as discussed in the previous lesson, you may recognize this from, or later we will, these kinds of signposts. You'd be surprised how often they're missing from teaching materials when a student really needs that to understand how things connect one to the other. And I think this is my last tip here, design for scanning, not for deep reading. So rather than giving paragraph after paragraph after paragraph, can we try to break it up a bit? Now, sometimes students have to read a lot online, that's fine. But where possible, can we chunk our information into small bits? Can we use lists, short lists, not long lists? Headings, visuals with captions, and so on, to break things up for the student, because this is how our eyes work on screen. So those are my main tips here. It's just really the tip of the iceberg to scratch the surface and get you thinking about your experiences and your learning and teaching design. So just ask, if you could think for a second, what needs to change in your students or in your own information environment? Is there anything that I've said here today that gets you interested in making a change or asking for a change? And a provocation, this is my last slide. we need a more critical approach to digital literacy. So it goes beyond designing for students. So it's not the burden, it shouldn't just be on us teachers. It should be on our institutions and our culture as a whole to be more critical of our digital tools, right? So not just loading dozens of tools onto people, but teaching how to use them, when to say no, how to engage with those tools, and so on. So curating this more thoughtfully. And that includes procurement at institutions. Okay, that's it for me. I'll just give you my contact info there. If anybody would like to get in touch, I'd be happy to hear from you about any of this. My email there. And I have a side project called universitymaterial.co.uk. I'm not sure what it's going to be yet, but I invite you to check that out. It's kind of teaching using these guidelines, teaching academic literacies using these guidelines that I've described. So thank you, Phil. I'm ready for questions.
Great, thank you. Another really great presentation. Yeah, lots of great reactions, and I also really liked the kind of the design for scanning rather than reading section. Someone with dyslexia, it can be not fun actually trying to get through to the right place, and sometimes you just give up after a while. So I think that's so important. If anyone has a question for Joshua, you can stick it in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we'll be able to unmute your mic. So you can ask Joshua. We've got one already. James, let me just unmute you. You should be able to ask your question, James. Are you there, James?
By the way, I like Jane's quote before. Jane, students don't like to be messed about too much by technology. Neither do I. That captured the spirit of my talk pretty nicely.
So we've got a question here, just from the chat, actually. So Susan, what is the risk that breaking projects up into scannable chunks detracts from students' ability to develop augmentation and make sense of more complex text? Argumentation, sorry, not augmentation.
I mean, I think a balanced approach might answer that. Just simply understanding that in some cases, longer texts are appropriate, and in some cases, breaking it up really is doing the student the biggest favor. But I think also training students to interact with text in different ways. That's part of the digital literacy piece, where reading on screen might not always be the right choice for every student. They might have to find a different device, or even use paper, or they might have to sort of figure out an on-screen option that isn't just the 21st tab on my browser, right? Which is a difficult way to read for a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, we've actually reached time now, so thank you. I think we did have a question from Mary Jacob asking if where she can read your article. I think she'd like to share it kind of with anyone outside of it. So.
Oh yeah, well, my paper isn't available quite yet. I'm still working on it, but if people just email me, I will sort of have a mailing list or something and let you know when it is.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, guys. I'll have a look in the Q&A.
Thank you.